Hi, Barry Ward here. I want to talk to you today about an important piece of legislation that has passed through both houses of the Oireachtas. It's called the Civil Law and Criminal Law Miscellaneous Provisions Bill 2020. Bear with me, I know it sounds awfully dull, but it actually is an important piece of legislation that reforms the court service, the coroner service and other aspects that have been highlighted through the COVID crisis as being insufficient to deal with the current circumstances that we're in. It went through the Shannon on the 28th of July and it went through the Dáil on the 30th of July, all stages, which meant that it was consolidated into a single day in each house. And the reason I want to talk about it is that one of the Sinn Féin TDs, Pierce Doherty, made a barnstorming speech about how this was designed to help vulture funds. Let's have a look at what he said.
This is about supporting vulture funds. I've sat in the Finance Committee for the whole term last year and before. Every single member of that committee, were looking to get vulture funds before our committee so we could question them about their practices.
That issue has nothing to do with this legislation. That's an issue for the compellability of witnesses before Oireachtas committees, and that was rejected by the people in a referendum. I think we'd all like to see them come before the committees, but the powers just aren't there to make it happen.
And sure, maybe the question is, why would they? When they have a government that is willing to not only pass legislation for them, but to pass emergency legislation.
But of course it isn't designed to help vulture funds. The reality is that this legislation does an awful lot of things. As I said, it deals with reform of the coroner system to ensure that if we suffer another pandemic or another catastrophe like the one that we're going through at the moment, the coroners are equipped and adaptable so they can deal with that situation. It creates provision in law for court hearings to be heard online so that people don't have to go to court in the case of a pandemic where they might be infecting other people or they might not be able to go because they're cocooning. It means there's an actual legislative basis for them to do that. And it creates a provision in relation to what are called business records. Now, this is an important evidential aspect which is already in Irish law, and it just expands it to remove the requirement for certain litigants to prove every single document as they go through a case. Pierce thinks that that's to help vulture funds.
Only do one thing, and that is to allow, in this chapter 12, 13 and 14, to allow vulture funds to rely on hearsay and inadmissible evidence, which will now be able to be relied on by those vulture funds in order to secure debts, to evict people from their homes and others. It is simply not acceptable.
It isn't. It's there to help the court system, and everybody benefits from that because when the court system works, there isn't a backlog, you don't have as many people required to go to court, and cases get dealt with more quickly, and that's to everyone's benefit, except people who want to draw them out.
The reforms in this chapter are based on the recommendations of the Law Reform Commission in its 2016 report, Consolidation and Reforms of Aspects of the Law of Evidence, and reflect similar provisions in the Criminal Evidence Act of 1992. In the great majority of cases, and in the previous absence of a statutory basis, many litigants in civil proceedings agree to admit documentary hearsay evidence in order to expedite proceedings.
So when you watch the false outrage of Deputy Doherty shouting about vulture funds, shouting about how this government is trying to undo things, just think about the facts. This was a piece of legislation that was drawn up from suggestions from an independent state agency that recognised gaps in the law of evidence, gaps that had been recognised by the courts as well. But what's really striking about this speech is the hypocrisy of Sinn Féin, because as I said, the bill went through the Shannon first on the 28th of July, and Sinn Féin welcomed it. They weren't going to oppose it.
Sinn Féin will be supporting the legislation, although we do have an amendment.
That's Neil O'Dongala. He's the leader of the Sinn Féin group in the Shannon and the Justice spokesperson. The amendment, incidentally, had nothing to do with removing the provisions relating to business records. It was to do with putting a sunset clause on the bill, which would have meant that it would have to be reviewed by the Houses in November. So when Pierce Doherty says,
"Now, you couldn't make this up,"
it kind of looks like he did.